My name is Angelica Santomauro, and I'm the director of the American Labor Museum Bato House National Landmark. Back in 1986, 4 years after the museum opened, I was teaching labor studies to elementary school students in Jersey City. The students were so turned on by the history of the labor movement that they organized their own student union, asking to negotiate a contract with the teachers and the administrators because they had some demands. Well, the word spread about these students organizing a union.
Would you be so kind as to tell me, as an educator yourself, the history of the Triangle Fire in New York City?
In March of 1911, there was a tragedy in New York City. It became known as the Triangle Shirtwaist Fire, when 146, mostly women and men, either burned to death or fell to their deaths as a result of a fire that broke out in this shirtwaist factory, and they were unable to get out because of locked doors and lack of fire escapes. Last year, for the anniversary, I was at the centennial commemoration, and there was a woman there who told a story about those who survived the fire. And I had read about several survivors, but not this particular person. He was the elevator operator. This man was determined to save every single person in that building. And he went up this one last time, and the young girls were so desperate to escape that they threw themselves on top of the elevator, and he was unable to get the elevator up again. This man suffered from depression the rest of his life because he blamed himself for being unable to save these women. So it's not only a story about those who perished, it's also a story about those who survived.
Could you tell me a little bit about the significance of us commemorating such tragedies today? I know that I'm also a public school teacher, and I know that as a union member, labor's really been under attack. We especially see that with Wisconsin. We see it with our own governor in New Jersey. Could you just talk to me a little bit about the significance of us remembering the labor and the lives of these women today, and why it's significant today, as loudly as you can?
When I taught in the Jersey City schools, I was teaching a beautiful patchwork quilt of students about American history, which was about military generals, presidents of the United States, and rich corporate magnates, all of whom happened to be white males. These students were not connecting with this history whatsoever. So when I started learning about the history of working people and immigrants, I actually came back and started telling my students their stories, the stories of the forgotten heroes. And my students were so turned on by the history of the labor movement because they were able to relate to these people, the quote, ordinary people who did extraordinary things. So it's very important to teach the history of the labor movement because it includes the people who helped develop this country. We often hear that it was the philanthropists, it was those who were affluent, who were the developers of this country. But without the blood, sweat, and tears of their workers, we wouldn't have the streets on which we now walk or the railroads on which we now ride. And these people should never be forgotten. Perished in 1911, should never be forgotten. They, unfortunately, sacrificed their lives for laws to be passed for safer working conditions. It was Francis Perkins, who subsequently became the Secretary of Labor under the Roosevelt administration, Franklin Delano Roosevelt administration, who was there at Washington Square Park and walked over and saw the flood of water mixed with blood running down the street, saw the bodies piled on top of one another. And it was she who was instrumental in bringing about those changes, first in New York City and then in the entire country. So yes, it's very important to shine a light on these heroes, because that's what they are, true heroes.
I know that you participated in the commemoration, the centennial commemoration of the 1910 Newark factory fire. And to me, the significance of the Newark factory fire through research has been that it preceded Triangle by only a few months, and it was mentioned in a lot of the court depositions after the tragedy, because people said, well, it happened in Newark, so why didn't anybody see this coming? And we know that people's, particularly working class women's lives, have been sacrificed for profit, right? To cram as many women as possible, to produce as many shirt gowns as possible,
Right.
especially right around Christmas time.
Right.
So I was wondering if you could speak a little bit, whatever you know about the 1910 Newark factory fire, and also maybe reflect on your presentation or being part of the commemoration panel.
4 months prior to the tragedy that took place at the Triangle Shirtwaist Building, a terrible fire broke out in November of 1910 in Newark, and 26 women were burnt or fell to their death. And this event, despite the fact that it received ample coverage and 100,000 people came out to remember them, as well as to protest the horrendous conditions that they worked under. It's something that is not taught in the schools. It's something that we don't remember. It was the efforts of a newspaper reporter, Guy Sterling, who put in his time, his money, and his effort to research this tragedy and bring light to it so everyone could know that this should never be repeated. A firehouse across the street from the building. They were not called. They didn't want the owner of the building, of the company, to look bad. They were telling the girls, put the fire out with sand. It was something that could have been prevented. And we can say that despite the fact that in 1910 this occurred, in 1911 occurred, and it shouldn't ever occur again, well, we had something comparable to it in 1991, 80 years later, when the poultry food processing factory in Hamlet, North Carolina, had the fire, and workers were locked in there as well, and 26 people perished. Why? Unfortunately, it's more respect for the dollar than for the people.
I was wondering if we could speak a little bit about the importance of memory, and how we could possibly use that towards activism. You know, that as a teacher, one of the things that you did was help your students relate to this powerful history of the working class person.
Yes.
Particularly with issues of immigration. So I was wondering if you could speak a little bit about how memory could be used for activism, because sometimes people say that maybe one of the reasons why Americans are not politically active right now is because they're amnesiac about their own history. That's not my thesis, but that's what some people think.
The house in which I work, the Botto House, is a house that represents all working people and immigrants. When we first started, our mission was to celebrate the contributions of workers and immigrants throughout the United States. Now that we have this global economy, we celebrate workers all over the world, and it's reflected in what we teach. It's reflected in our cultural programs, and it's reflected in our exhibits. Why do we bother to include these people? Because they need to be remembered. They need to be celebrated. They need to be honored for what they have done. People have worked for minimum wages. People have sacrificed to get a living wage. They have organized. They've given up their lives. These people need to be honored. It's a history that people like you and I can relate to. It's a history that is one that, although sorely neglected in textbooks, is one that we find to be most interesting. Unfortunately, publishers of textbooks are companies that very often are owned by wealthy people who see history in a different light. But those who consider themselves more progressive and more enlightened include a history that we share here at the Botto House. As a teacher, I recognized the fact that I was telling my students to sit up straight, get in line, and to conform to certain rules and regulations in the classroom. When I studied labor studies and brought it back to the classroom, I felt hypocritical in doing so. I thought if I really wanted to graduate students to be involved in our democracy, then they needed to participate in a democracy in the school. So when they were so moved by the stories that they heard about these everyday heroes who sacrificed to bring about positive change for themselves and for others, these students said, "We're organizing a union." I couldn't say no. The students decided to form a union. I couldn't say no. They wanted to negotiate a contract. So I called together the principal, the other teachers, and my favorite proposal was from the boys. They said, "The girls have doors on the stalls in their restrooms, and we have none. We would like to have doors so we have privacy." The principal was sympathetic. He understood. And by September of the following year, the boys had doors on the stalls in their restrooms. That is empowerment. Whoever had such a voice in a school environment? Another success story is when the museum hosted its first Labor Day parade. I started working here in 1992. That was the first year we had the Labor Day parade. It was a very small parade, but the IWW came out, the Industrial Workers of the World, the Wobblies, the people who represented the strikers here in Paterson. One of the Wobblies was one of my students who I taught, and it was so wonderful. I said, "This is success," as he stood there waving his flag in our parade.
Speaking of gender, as you mentioned, the boys' victory with having privacy in the restroom. But speaking of gender, in my research of memorials, I've noticed that we memorialize our wars, right? And we have lots of monuments towards our wars, and monuments for first responders that are typically represented by male bodies, whether they're firefighters or police officers. But there seem to be very few permanent monuments to women. I know the New York City Triangle Coalition is looking to build a permanent monument, and they're fundraising towards that goal right now. I know that Guy Sterling has an agreement with the Mormon church that purchased that lot to have a plaque.
Right.
We don't know when that's going to happen. But I was wondering if you could speak a little bit about how we remember working class women, because as much as we don't honor the working class enough as a whole,
Right.
a lot of times when we do, we think of the auto workers, or we think of particularly
Teamsters.
or Teamsters. We really think of the boys' unions seemingly more. So I was wondering if you could speak a little bit on gender and remembering working class women and why that's important in the United States today.
This year, 2012, commemorates the Bread and Roses strike in Lawrence, Massachusetts. I was fortunate enough to go to Lawrence to see the exhibits that are being shown to remember mostly women who fought for such wonderful benefits that they did win. And it was heartwarming to see women celebrated in their exhibit hall. We don't have enough of that. It's something that when you do see it, you're actually surprised when you see it. I also had the opportunity to go to Knoxville, Tennessee, and there's a beautiful sculpture of women standing in protest and in honor of the 19th Amendment when women got the vote. And again, it's surprising to see. It shouldn't be surprising to see monuments or exhibits celebrating women, because women were shoulder to shoulder with the men on picket lines. Even their children were brought out. And they should never be forgotten, because their role has been so important. We must never forget the Rosie the Riveters during World War II, when they were in the factories. During that time, there were less accidents and there were less mistakes made with the ships that were being built and the uniforms that were being made, etc., etc. Yet, when the men came back from the war, the women were displaced, go back into the home, have your children, and take care of the household. Why? No rationale. Women need to be recognized. We've come a long way, but not to the point that we need to be. We still get 76 cents on the dollar in our wage balance. There's no reason for that. We work as hard, we sacrifice as much, and if I am not mistaken, I believe that the percentage of women workers now exceeds the number of men in the workplace. Hello, it's time to do something about that.
I was wondering if you could speak a little bit about some of the laws and some of the changes that were made in housing codes, construction codes, fire safety, workplace safety as a result of these tragedies, and maybe as a result of the activism that these tragedies spurred.
The Occupational Safety and Health Administration was formed to ensure safety in the workplace. Supervisors were sent out to workplaces to be sure that there were no problems that could endanger the workers. Unfortunately, in the 80s, under the administration of President Ronald Reagan, the number of supervisors were drastically cut, and the amount remaining would enable one supervisor to visit a work site every 100 years. So if a supervisor were to come to a factory today, they wouldn't be back for another 100 years. So are our workplaces safe today? The question still remains. Despite the laws to protect us, despite the fire improvements with these structures, we still have problems in the workplace because no one is keeping an eye out to ensure that the workplace is safe. The AFL-CIO, the American Federation of Labor, Congress of Industrial Organizations, has a holiday every year. It's called Workers' Memorial Day. It's held on April the 28th. And on that day, people all over the country remember those who were either injured or killed in the workplace. Here at the American Labor Museum, we have a candlelight vigil, and we go to the New Jersey Department of Labor and ask them for the names of the people who were injured or killed on the job throughout the past year. And I'm so sorry to say that we have nearly 100 names that we read at every single candlelight vigil. So our hope is to someday stand in front of the group and say, this year we have no names to read. But that can only come with the enforcement of our laws.
What do you think might be some of the solutions going forward? It seems that, especially through outsourcing, a lot of American companies don't really want to produce in the United States because they could do so in other places where they can exploit workers to a greater extent without really kind of being penalized and without being held to any kind of order. What are your thoughts on that? What are your hopes for the future? As loudly as you can.
My hope for the future lies with the Occupy movement. If ever you get the opportunity to sit and speak with these wonderful people who have come together to discuss the importance of justice for all, they will lead you to a very, very hopeful direction. I was at a meeting and realized that it is they who can take us in the right direction, because they know that the world is at their fingertips. They can organize globally simply through the internet, through social media. They have people who they're communicating with all over the globe. If we can organize globally, we won't have the problem with exploitation of workers in third world countries, because those workers will rise up as well, and they will demand their rights. How dare we allow countries who have no human rights policies to trade with us? Have we no scruples? Have we no morals? The Occupy movement is definitely where I find a great deal of hope. And when I had the opportunity to speak with the occupiers, they realized how important it is to be coupled with the labor movement. The experienced people who have been out there, the rank and file, who have been on picket lines for many years, who have negotiated contracts for many years, who have fought for the rights of working people for so many years. So to couple the Occupy movement with the labor movement, there's only a positive way to go.
I have one last question.
Okay.
I was wondering if you could reflect a little bit on how we could use the memory of the Newark fire and the New York City Triangle fire, and how maybe we could galvanize that memory or energize that memory to encourage people to be politically active for human rights and for workers' rights.
As a teacher, I always go back into the classroom. I truly believe that stories such as the 1910 tragedy and the Triangle Shirtwaist Fire can be infused into the curriculum through music, through art, through language arts, of course, through social studies. all of this education that the children will take with them to their adulthood and implement it in the workplace. They take it home to their families, hopefully discussing it with them at the dinner table. Dad, are you in a union? Mom, are you in a union? When I first started working here at the American Labor Museum, I had a group of Boy Scouts sitting in front of me. And I said to them, can anyone tell me what the word labor means? And a little boy raised his hand and said, I know. Abraham Lincoln was the President of the United States. Another one said, no, labor has to do with when mommies have babies. They don't even know the meaning of the word. How can we expect to graduate activists? How can we expect them to understand if they're not being taught? How can we expect union members to think they need to play a role in their union other than paying dues if they don't even know that they should have a voice, that they should go to meetings, that they should go to the rallies and stand on the picket lines? How could we expect it if we keep saying to our students, sit up straight, get in line, conform? We need to have a participatory democracy. And that is how we will see a better world for all of us.